July 5th, 1943. 2:30 a.m. The pre-dawn darkness over the Kursk salient was shattered by a sound unlike anything the world had ever heard. 700 German artillery pieces and rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously along a 120-mile front, their muzzle flashes turning night into hellish day. The roar was so loud that Soviet soldiers 30 miles from the front reported feeling the ground shake beneath their feet. This was Operation Citadel, Adolf Hitler's last great offensive gamble on the Eastern Front, and it was about to trigger the largest tank battle in human history. What the Germans didn't know as their barrage tore apart Soviet positions was that their enemy had been expecting them. Soviet intelligence had penetrated German planning so deeply that Marshal Georgy Zhukov knew the exact date and time of the attack days in advance. More crucially, the Soviets had spent 2 months turning the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified region on Earth, a killing ground designed specifically to bleed the Wehrmacht's armoured forces white. The strategic situation that led to Kursk began with Germany's catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943. The Sixth Army's destruction cost Germany 300,000 casualties and shattered the myth of German invincibility. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's brilliant counteroffensive in March recaptured Kharkov and stabilized the front, but it left a massive Soviet-held bulge jutting 120 miles into German lines around the city of Kursk. This bulge was both an opportunity and a threat. For Hitler, it represented a chance to regain the initiative through a classic double envelopment. 2 massive panzer armies would slice off the bulge at its base, trapping and destroying Soviet forces inside. For the Soviets, it was an obvious target that they could prepare to defend in depth. The delay would prove fatal to German hopes. Hitler originally wanted to attack in May, but constant postponements to wait for new weapons, particularly the Panther and Tiger tanks, pushed the offensive back to July. This gave the Soviets precious time to construct defensive positions of unprecedented scale and sophistication. By early July, the Kursk salient contained 8 defensive belts, stretching back nearly 200 miles. The Soviets had dug 5,000 miles of trenches, laid 400,000 mines, constructed 20,000 artillery positions, and created anti-tank strongpoints every few hundred yards. They had assembled barely 300,000 soldiers, 3,600 tanks, 20,000 artillery pieces, and 2,400 aircraft. This wasn't a defensive position. It was a carefully engineered trap designed to channel German armour into pre-planned killing zones. The German plan called for a 2-pronged assault. In the north, Field Marshal Walter Model's 9th Army would attack southward from Orel with 335,000 men and 590 tanks. In the south, General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf would drive northward with 349,000 men and 1,169 tanks. The two forces would meet at Kursk, encircling Soviet forces inside the bulge. On paper, it was the classic German blitzkrieg formula that had worked so brilliantly in Poland, France, and the early months of the Russian campaign. But this wasn't 1941. The Red Army of 1943 was not the disorganized, ill-equipped force the Germans had faced 2 years earlier. Soviet commanders had learned hard lessons about mobile warfare. Their tank forces were better organized, their anti-tank defenses more sophisticated, their artillery coordination more effective. Most importantly, they now had the T-34 in massive numbers, a tank that could match or exceed German armour in most categories. The German artillery barrage that began at 2:30 a.m. on July 5th was supposed to soften Soviet defences for the initial assault. Instead, it revealed one of the war's most significant intelligence coups. Soviet reconnaissance units had identified the German jump-off positions so precisely that Soviet artillery began counter-battery fire before the German barrage even started. Hundreds of German guns were destroyed or damaged before they could support the attack. When German infantry and armour moved forward at dawn, they found Soviet defenders who were shaken but very much intact and waiting. In the northern sector, Model's 9th Army immediately ran into trouble. The 6th Infantry Division, attacking in the first wave, managed to advance only 6 miles in 2 days at the cost of 50% casualties. The heavily wooded and swampy terrain favoured defenders, and Soviet anti-tank guns positioned on reverse slopes devastated German armour trying to break through. Model had concentrated his armour, including 90 of the new Ferdinand tank destroyers, but the Ferdinands proved to be rolling disasters. These 65-ton monsters mounted the powerful 88-meter gun but lacked machine guns for self-defense. Soviet infantry swarmed them with Molotov cocktails and satchel charges, destroying dozens in the first days. The southern attack under Hoth initially made better progress. The terrain was more open, favouring armour operations, and Hoth commanded the Elite II SS Panzer Corps, including the Leibstandart Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions. These were the Wehrmacht's shock troops, veteran formations that had never tasted defeat. Leading their advance were the new Tiger Y heavy tanks and Panther medium tanks, Germany's technological answer to the T-34. The Tiger I was a monster weighing 56 tons and mounting the legendary 80mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Its armour, up to 100mm thick on the front, was immune to most anti-tank weapons. A single Tiger could dominate a battlefield, and the Germans had concentrated over 140 of them for Citadel. The Panther, rushed into production to counter the T-34, was designed to combine firepower, armour and mobility. Its 75mm gun could penetrate any Soviet tank, and its sloped armour mimicked the T-34's most effective feature. On paper, these new weapons should have been war winners. In practice, they revealed the difference between German engineering and Soviet pragmatism. The Panthers suffered catastrophic mechanical failures. Of the 200 deployed at Kursk, only 43 were operational by the end of the first day due to transmission failures, engine fires, and suspension problems. The Tigers, while formidable in combat, consumed fuel at prodigious rates and broke down frequently in the dusty Russian summer. The Ferdinands, as mentioned, were death traps for their crews. The Soviets, by contrast, fielded simpler but more reliable tanks. The T-34-76 was crude by German standards, with a cramped interior, poor visibility, and a two-man turret that overworked the commander. But it was mechanically reliable, easy to repair, and produced in thousands. More importantly, the Soviets had learned to employ their armour in concentrated masses, rather than the penny packet deployments of 1941. Tank brigades and corps could now manoeuvre as coherent units, trading individual tank quality for overwhelming numbers. By July 7th, 2 days into the offensive, the Germans had advanced 10 to 12 miles in the south, but at enormous cost. The Tertiary SS Panzer Corps had lost over 100 tanks and taken 3,000 casualties. In the north, Model's advance had stalled completely after gaining only 6 miles. The Soviet defensive system was working exactly as planned. German armour was channeled into killing zones where dug-in T-34s, anti-tank guns and minefields inflicted steady attrition. For every mile gained, the Germans paid in blood and steel they could not afford to lose. The terrain itself became an enemy. July 1943 brought unusual heat to the region, turning the famous Russian Black Earth into clouds of choking dust that clogged air filters and reduced visibility to yards. Thunderstorms transformed the same ground into bottomless mud that bogged down even tracked vehicles. German logistics, stretched thin by the vast distances of Russia, struggled to keep frontline units supplied with fuel and ammunition. Soviet tactics evolved as the battle progressed. Rather than meet German armour head-on in open combat, Soviet tank commanders used their knowledge of the terrain to set ambushes. T-34s would hide behind ridgelines or in woods, allowing German tanks to pass, then emerge to shoot them from the sides and rear where armour was thinnest. Pack front anti-tank positions, featuring dozens of guns in mutually supporting positions, created zones of destruction that even Tigers hesitated to enter. The decisive phase began on July 11th when Hoth's 4th Panzer Army approached the small town of Prokhorovka, about 50 miles southeast of Kursk. This rolling farmland, broken by small hills and ravines, would become the site of history's greatest tank battle. Hoth planned to commit the 2nd SS Panzer Corps to a breakthrough that would finally rupture the Soviet defensive system and allow a dash to Kursk. The Germans concentrated approximately 600 tanks and assault guns for the assault, including over 100 Tigers and Panthers. What Hoth didn't know was that the Soviets were preparing a massive counterattack at the same location. The 5th Guards Tank Army under Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov had been held in reserve specifically for this moment. Rotmistrov commanded 850 tanks, mostly T-34s, organised into 3 tank corps. Stalin had given Rotmistrov explicit orders: stop the German advance, at any cost. Rotmistrov faced a terrible problem. His T-34s were outgunned by German armour, especially the Tigers, whose 80mm guns could destroy a T-34 at 500 yards, while the T-34's 70mm gun needed to close to 500 yards for a reliable kill. In open terrain, this range advantage would be decisive, but Prokhorovka's rolling landscape offered an opportunity. If Soviet tanks could close the distance quickly, getting inside the Germans' effective range, their numerical superiority and higher speed could overwhelm German firepower. Rotmistrov's plan was audacious to the point of madness. He would launch a massed tank charge at dawn on July 12th, throwing his entire army forward in a single massive wave. The T-34s would race across the open ground at maximum speed, accepting hideous losses to close with the Germans before their range advantage could be decisive. Once intermixed with German tanks, the battle would become a point-blank brawl where Soviet numbers and the T-34's superior manoeuvrability would prevail. The morning of July 12th broke hot and clear over Prokhorovka. At 8:30 a.m., after a brief artillery barrage, 850 Soviet tanks surged forward in a formation so dense that their intervals were measured in yards rather than the hundreds of yards normal doctrine demanded. SS Panzer crews, positioning for their own attack, watched in shock as a wall of Soviet armour materialised from the morning haze. The distance separating the two forces was less than 1,000 yards. What followed was mechanised warfare at its most savage and chaotic. German tank commanders, trained to fight at range where their superior optics and guns gave them every advantage, suddenly found Soviet tanks among them before they could properly deploy. Tigers that could have massacred T-34s at 500 yards were swamped by multiple tanks attacking from different directions at point-blank range. The battle dissolved into hundreds of individual combats, tanks circling and firing at ranges so close that shells couldn't miss. The sound was indescribable. Hundreds of tank engines roaring, cannon firing in continuous thunder, machine guns chattering, ammunition exploding, steel screaming against steel as tanks collided. Smoke and dust reduced visibility to nearly zero. Tank commanders fought blind, firing at muzzle flashes and shapes in the murk. Knocked-out tanks became obstacles and cover, creating a maze that further confused the battle. Senior Sergeant Nikolai Zhukov, commanding a T-34 in the 32nd Tank Brigade, described the horror in a post-war interview. "We came over the hill and saw Germans everywhere. Tigers, Panthers, Mark IVs, all mixed together and pointing at us. I thought we were dead, but we were moving so fast they didn't have time to aim properly. I saw the Panther in front of me fire. The shell went over our turret, then we rammed him. We hit so hard that my driver broke his collarbone, but the impact threw off the German's aim. My gunner put a round into his side from 5 meters. The Panther exploded. Then we were in the middle of them, spinning and firing. I lost track of everything. I remember shooting at a Tiger from behind. I remember our tank being hit 3 times, but the shells didn't penetrate. I remember my loader screaming because his hand was crushed in the breach. It went on forever. When it finally ended, I climbed out and counted 11 wrecked tanks within 50 meters of our position. 5 were German. 6 were ours. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division, the elite of the elite, found itself fighting for survival. SS Hauptsturmführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop, commanding a Tiger company, reported engaging 15 T-34s simultaneously at ranges under 100 yards. His company destroyed all 15 but lost 4 Tigers in the process, an exchange rate that horrified German commanders who counted on Tigers being nearly invulnerable. The battle lasted 8 hours, from 8:30 a.m. until 4:30 in the afternoon, by which time the battlefield was a smoking graveyard of burning armour. Soviet losses were catastrophic. Rotmistrov's 5th Guards. Tank Army lost approximately 340 tanks destroyed and another 400 damaged. Some brigades were effectively annihilated. The 32nd Tank Brigade entered battle with 98 tanks and ended the day with 7 operational machines. But German losses, while smaller in absolute numbers, were strategically devastating. The Czechny SS Panzer Corps lost between 150 and 200 tanks, including dozens of irreplaceable Tigers and Panthers. More importantly, they had been stopped. The breakthrough to Kursk that Hoth needed would not happen. The German armoured spearhead was blunted. That night, while both sides counted their losses and evacuated wounded, Adolf Hitler received news that would doom Operation Citadel. Allied forces had landed in Sicily, opening a new front that demanded immediate German attention. Simultaneously, Soviet forces had launched Operation Kutuzov, a massive counter-offensive against the Orel salient north of Kursk, threatening to encircle Model's Ninth Army. Hitler summoned his commanders and ordered Citadel cancelled. The panzers would be withdrawn to meet the new threats. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, argued passionately for continuing the offensive. His forces were on the brink of breaking through. Another few days of combat would crack the Soviet defences, but Hitler was adamant. The strategic situation had changed. Germany could no longer afford the luxury of offensive operations in Russia. The decision marked a fundamental shift in the war. Never again would Germany launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. From July 1943 onward, the Wehrmacht would fight a continuous retreat westward, trading space for time that would eventually run out at the gates of Berlin. The battle continued for several more days as German forces fought to disengage and Soviet forces pressed their advantage. By July 23rd, when operations finally ceased, the Germans had been pushed back to their starting positions or beyond. The Kursk salient remained in Soviet hands. The casualties were staggering. German losses totaled approximately 170,000 men killed, wounded or missing, and between 760 and 1,000 tanks and assault guns destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Soviet losses were even higher in absolute terms, perhaps 320,000 casualties, and over 1,600 tanks lost. But the Soviets could replace their losses. Germany could not. The panzer divisions that fought at Kursk never recovered their strength. The carefully husbanded armoured reserve that Hitler had assembled for Citadel was squandered in 2 weeks of attritional fighting. Worse, the cream of Germany's tank commanders, the veterans who had led panzer spearheads since Poland, were killed or wounded in numbers that could not be replaced. SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, who had become Germany's top-scoring tank ace, survived Prokhorovka, but noted in his diary that his company lost 9 of its 14 tank commanders in a single day. The technical lessons were equally devastating for Germany. The vaunted Panther proved to be a mechanical disaster. Its rushed development meant chronic reliability problems that plagued the type until war's end. The Tiger, while formidable in combat, was too expensive, too slow to produce, and too mechanically complex for sustained operations. Germany would produce 1,347 Tigers during the entire war. The Soviet Union produced over 58,000 T-34s. Soviet commanders learned crucial lessons as well. The mass tank charges at Prokhorovka had stopped the Germans, but at horrific cost. Future operations would emphasize combined arms cooperation, with tanks supported by infantry, artillery and air power, rather than charging unsupported into German guns. Soviet tactics became more sophisticated, utilizing the T-34's advantages in mobility and reliability, while mitigating its disadvantages in firepower and armor. The new generation of Soviet tanks already in development would address these shortcomings. The T-34-85, mounting a far more powerful 85mm gun, began reaching units in early 1944. The IS-2 heavy tank with its 122mm gun and heavy armor could match the Tiger on equal terms. Most importantly, Soviet production capacity was hitting its stride. By 1944, Soviet factories would produce 29,000 tanks annually, more than Germany produced during the entire war. The air battle over Kursk was equally significant, though often overshadowed by the tank combat. The Luftwaffe committed over 800 aircraft to support Citadel, including their best fighter units equipped with Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs. They faced approximately 2,400 Soviet aircraft. The resulting air battles were among the largest of the war, with hundreds of aircraft engaged simultaneously. German pilots initially enjoyed success, their superior training and aircraft quality allowing them to rack up impressive kill ratios. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, leading a Jagdgeschwader, shot down 6 Soviet aircraft on July 5th alone. But the Germans couldn't maintain the tempo. The Luftwaffe's logistics were stretched thin, and battle damage reduced sortie rates as the campaign progressed. Soviet aviation, while suffering heavy losses, could replace them from vast reserves. By the battle's second week, Soviet aircraft achieved local air superiority over critical sectors, allowing Il-2 ground attack aircraft to savage German armour with rockets and cannon fire. The human cost of Kursk extended far beyond the casualty figures. Soviet soldiers fought with a desperation born of defending their homeland against an enemy who had committed unspeakable atrocities. German troops, increasingly aware that they were losing the war, fought with the courage of desperation. Individual acts of heroism were common on both sides. Soviet tank crews stayed with burning vehicles to get off one last shot. German anti-tank gunners held their positions until Soviet tanks overran them. Medics on both sides risked their lives retrieving wounded from between the lines. The psychological impact on German troops was profound. Unteroffizier Helmut Pabst, serving with the Grossdeutschland Division, wrote in his diary about watching waves of Soviet tanks advancing through fields of burning wrecks. "They keep coming. We destroy 10 and 20 more appear. Our commander says we've killed 2,000 tanks. I believe him. I've seen hundreds burning, but still they come. How many do they have? How can we win this?" The answer was that they couldn't. The Battle of Kursk marked the point where the Eastern Front's strategic balance shifted irreversibly. Before Kursk, Germany could still imagine victory through one more great offensive, one more encirclement of Soviet armies. After Kursk, German strategy reduced to delaying inevitable defeat as long as possible. The Soviet Union immediately exploited their victory. While the Germans were still extracting themselves from the Kursk salient, Soviet forces launched Operation Kutuzov in the north and Operation Rumyantsev in the south. These counter-offensives liberated Orel and Belgorod within weeks, pushing the Germans back toward the Dnieper River. By September 1943, the Soviets had liberated Kharkov, and by November they had established bridgeheads across the Dnieper. The Wehrmacht's long retreat had begun. German generals later debated whether Operation Citadel was a mistake. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein argued that if launched in May, as originally planned before Soviet defences were fully prepared, Citadel might have succeeded. General Heinz Guderian, inspector of panzer troops, opposed the operation from the start, arguing that Germany should have stood on the defensive and let the Soviets batter themselves against prepared positions. Adolf Hitler himself admitted to Guderian before the battle, "You're right. Whenever I think of this attack, my stomach turns over." The debate misses the essential point. By July 1943, Germany had already lost the war on the Eastern Front. The question wasn't whether Germany could win, but how long they could delay defeat. The Soviet Union's vast population, enormous industrial capacity, and willingness to accept casualties that would have broken any Western nation made their eventual victory inevitable once the Germans failed to win in 1941. Kursk accelerated this inevitable outcome by destroying Germany's last mobile reserve and eliminating any possibility of regaining the initiative. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht was reduced to reacting to Soviet offensives, fighting a continuous series of desperate defensive battles with ever-dwindling resources against an enemy that grew stronger with each passing month. The battlefield of Prokhorovka today is marked by a massive memorial to the tank battle. A 50-metre tall monument dominates the landscape, visible for miles across the rolling fields. The text reads, "To the heroes of the Battle of Kursk." Nearby, several T-34s and a German Panther sit as permanent exhibits, silent witnesses to the carnage that occurred here. Local farmers still occasionally uncover evidence of the battle. Shells, tank parts, and human remains emerge from the black earth, particularly after heavy rains. The ground itself bears scars visible from aerial photographs, depressions where tanks exploded or artillery struck, traces of trenches and anti-tank ditches still visible 80 years later. Veterans of both sides who returned to visit the battlefield in later years were struck by how small the area actually was. The epic clash that involved nearly 1,500 tanks occurred across a space of perhaps 10 square miles. The density of combat was such that at the battle's height there were over 100 tanks per square mile, mechanized warfare at an intensity never seen before or since. The technical analysis of knocked-out tanks provided invaluable intelligence to both sides. Soviet engineers studied captured Panthers and Tigers, noting their strengths and weaknesses. The sloped armor concept validated Soviet designers' choices. The powerful guns influenced Soviet development of the 85 Limest and 122-minute weapons. But Soviet analysis also noted the Panther's mechanical complexity and poor reliability, reinforcing their philosophy of simpler, more producible designs. German engineers studying knocked-out T-34s gained respect for Soviet pragmatism. The T-34's sloped armour, wide tracks for ground pressure distribution, and diesel engine for safety and range were all superior to German practice, but they also noted the crude finish, poor optics, and cramped crew conditions. German analysis concluded correctly that Soviet tanks were optimized for mass production and ease of operation by hastily trained crews, while German tanks were optimized for quality and performance. In a war of attrition, the Soviet approach proved superior. The strategic consequences rippled outward. The Battle of Kursk convinced Turkey and Japan to remain neutral rather than attack the Soviet Union, decisions that freed Soviet divisions for use against Germany. It encouraged partisan movements across occupied Europe by demonstrating that Germany could be beaten. It solidified the unlikely alliance between the Soviet Union, Britain, and America by proving that the Soviets could not only survive but defeat Germany's best forces. For the soldiers who fought there, Kursk became the defining experience of their lives. Soviet veterans spoke of it with pride, the moment when they broke the Wehrmacht's back. German veterans recalled it with bitter resignation, the battle where they knew, even if they couldn't admit it, that the war was lost. The psychological shock of defeat affected German morale throughout the army. If the elite panzer divisions, equipped with the best tanks Germany could produce, led by experienced commanders, couldn't break through, what hope remained? The final German assessment of Operation Citadel came from General Heinz Guderian, who wrote in his post-war memoir, "Needless to say, the Russians exploited their victory to the full. There were to be no more periods of quiet on the Eastern Front. From now on, the enemy was in undisputed possession of the initiative." Those two sentences encapsulated the strategic reality. Germany would fight on for another 22 months, inflicting and suffering terrible casualties, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Battle of Kursk, particularly the tank clash at Prokhorovka, represented the collision of two fundamentally different approaches to warfare. Germany relied on technical superiority, tactical brilliance, and the fighting quality of highly trained soldiers. The Soviet Union relied on mass production, strategic depth, and willingness to accept casualties that would have been politically unacceptable to any Western nation. At Kursk, mass defeated quality, industrial capacity defeated technical sophistication, strategic patience defeated tactical brilliance. The approximately 2,000 tanks that fought at Prokhorovka on July 12, 1943, represented less than 2 weeks of Soviet tank production, but nearly 6 months of German production. That simple mathematical reality decided the battle before the first shot was fired. Germany could win tactical engagements, could destroy Soviet tanks at ratios of 3-1 or even higher, and still lose because the Soviets would replace their losses while German losses were permanent. The veterans who fought in history's greatest tank battle carried its memories for the rest of their lives. Soviet tanker Ivan Yakubovsky, who commanded a tank battalion at Prokhorovka and later rose to become Marshal of the Soviet Union and Commander-in-Chief of Warsaw Pact Forces, said in a 1978 interview, "Prokhorovka was hell on earth. I've fought in many battles, but nothing compared to that day. The noise, the smoke, the flames, the constant impact of shells on armour. You couldn't think, couldn't plan, could only react and shoot and hope to survive the next second. I commanded 35 tanks that morning. By evening, I had 7. We won, but the price was terrible. I lost friends, men I'd served with for 2 years, good men, brave men. Sometimes I dream I'm back there, trapped in the smoke and fire, and I wake up gasping. Victory, yes, but at such a cost." The German perspective was captured by SS Oberscharführer Fritz Langenese, a Tiger commander who fought at Prokhorovka and survived the war. "We killed them by the dozen, by the score. My Tiger destroyed 14 T-34s that day, a proven count from our records, but they kept coming like waves against a seawall. Eventually the wall breaks. We ran low on ammunition, our engine overheated, we took hits that didn't penetrate but damaged our running gear. By afternoon, we had to withdraw. As we pulled back, I looked at the battlefield. Burning tanks everywhere, hundreds of them, most of them Soviet but many German. I realized then that we would lose the war. They could afford these losses. We couldn't." The Battle of Kursk, and especially the armoured clash at Prokhorovka, stands as the largest tank battle in history, a record that will almost certainly never be broken. Modern warfare has moved beyond mass tank formations, but even if it hadn't, no nation could or would commit forces on the scale of Kursk. The battle consumed resources and lives at a rate that staggers comprehension. In 2 weeks of combat, the two sides fired approximately 5 million artillery shells, expended tens of millions of small arms rounds, and lost nearly 3,000 tanks. The fuel consumption alone would have supplied a modern nation for weeks. Standing on the fields around Prokhorovka today, it's hard to imagine the mechanical apocalypse that occurred here. The land has been farmed for decades, the scars mostly healed. But dig down a few feet almost anywhere within the battle zone and you'll find evidence, shell fragments, bullets, bits of tank, reminders that this peaceful farmland was once the most deadly place on Earth. The Russian government has declared the entire battlefield area a protected historical site, ensuring that future generations can visit and remember. The lessons of Kursk echo through military history, the importance of intelligence and defensive preparation, demonstrated by Soviet success in predicting and preparing for the German attack. The value of reserves, shown by the timely commitment of Soviet tank armies that sealed German defeat. The limitation of technological advantage when facing overwhelming numbers, proven by the Tigers and Panthers that won tactical engagements but lost the strategic battle. The crucial importance of logistics and sustainability, highlighted by German mechanical failures and fuel shortages. Above all, Kursk demonstrated that in industrial warfare, production capacity ultimately determines victory more than battlefield prowess. When military historians compile their lists of decisive battles, Kursk ranks among the most significant. It ended Germany's offensive capability on the Eastern Front, ensuring that from July 1943 onward, the Red Army would advance continuously westward until meeting Allied forces in the ruins of Berlin. It validated Soviet military doctrine and vindicated Stalin's brutal industrialization program of the 1930s, which had created the factories that now buried Germany under an avalanche of tanks, guns, and aircraft. It confirmed that the Eastern Front was where the Second World War would be decided and that Germany's fate was sealed. The steel that clashed at Prokhorovka wrote the ending of the Eastern Front story in fire and blood. Germany's last great offensive gamble had failed. The tide had turned. The thunder of 2,000 tanks battling for supremacy over a few miles of Russian farmland announced that the Red Army was coming west and that nothing could stop them. The Battle of Kursk had become the greatest tank clash in history, and Germany had lost. The aftermath of Kursk rippled through the German military hierarchy like an earthquake. At Rastenburg, Hitler's East Prussian headquarters, the mood in late July 1943 was funereal. General Adolf Heusinger, Chief of Operations for the German Army High Command, recalled Hitler staring at maps of the Eastern Front for hours, saying nothing, his hands trembling visibly. The Führer who had confidently predicted victory after victory now faced the reality that his armies were in full retreat on a front stretching 1,500 miles from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The immediate tactical situation was catastrophic. Soviet Operation Rumyantsev, launched on August 3rd, just 3 weeks after Kursk, aimed to liberate Belgorod and Kharkov. General Ivan Konev's Steppe Front and General Nikolai Vatutin's Voronezh Front, reinforced with fresh divisions held in reserve during the defensive phase, now attacked with overwhelming force. The German 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf, still recovering from Kursk's losses, couldn't hold. Belgorod fell on August 5th. For the first time in the war, Moscow fired victory salvos, 124 guns saluting the liberation. The precedent would be repeated hundreds of times as Soviet forces liberated city after city on their march to Berlin. Kharkov, the industrial city that had changed hands 4 times since 1941, fell on August 23rd despite Hitler's orders to hold at all costs. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, withdrew against Hitler's explicit orders, choosing to save his armies rather than lose them in a futile defense. Hitler raged but couldn't deny the logic. The alternative was another Stalingrad, another army lost in a pointless stand. The pattern was set. German commanders would spend the next 20 months extracting their forces from encirclements, while Hitler demanded they stand and die. The casualty figures from July and August stunned German commanders. Army Group Center and Army Group South together lost 363,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in 2 months. Tank losses exceeded 1,500. Artillery losses approached 2,000 guns. Entire divisions existed only on paper, their infantry regiments reduced to battalion strength, their tank battalions possessing a handful of operational vehicles. The 3rd Panzer Division, which had entered Operation Citadel with 100 tanks, fielded only 12 by September 1st. Replacement of these losses was impossible. Germany's entire 1943 tank production was 5,966 vehicles of all types. Soviet production that same year was 24,089 tanks. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. Germany lost tanks faster than they could build them while facing an enemy who could replace losses 4 times over. Hans Guderian, now Inspector General of Panzer Troops, submitted a report to Hitler in September 1943 that laid out the mathematics of doom. At current loss rates, the Panzer Force would cease to exist as an offensive weapon by mid-1944. Hitler read the report, then ordered it classified and never mentioned again. The human cost was equally irreplaceable. Germany's 1943 conscription yielded 2.1 million men, but these were teenagers and men in their 30s, not the physically prime soldiers of 1941. Training time was cut from 6 months to 6 weeks, as demands for replacements overwhelmed the training system. These hastily prepared soldiers arrived at the front with minimal knowledge of their weapons, no understanding of combined arms tactics, and often inadequate equipment. Their life expectancy measured in days rather than months. Soviet losses were even higher in absolute numbers, but the Soviet system could absorb them. The 1943 Soviet conscription brought 10 million men into service. Soviet training was even more abbreviated than Germany's, sometimes as short as 2 weeks. But Soviet tactics were simpler and relied on mass rather than individual skill. A poorly trained Soviet soldier in a good defensive position with anti-tank weapons could still destroy German tanks. A poorly trained German soldier attacking prepared Soviet positions died quickly and accomplished nothing. The technological balance was shifting decisively. The T-34-85, entering production in December 1943, mounted an 85mm gun that could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armour at 500 yards and a Panther's at 1,000 yards. The Sherman tank, arriving from America in thousands through Lend-Lease, was inferior to German armour in direct combat but reliable, easy to maintain, and produced in vast numbers. By late 1943, Soviet tank brigades often fielded mixed formations of T-34s, T-34 T-85s, American Shermans and British Churchills, an armoured United Nations dedicated to destroying German armour. German industry responded with increasingly desperate measures. The Panther's teething problems were gradually resolved, and by early 1944 it was a formidable weapon, but production never exceeded 3,000 per year. The Tiger II, even heavier and more powerful than the original Tiger, entered service in 1944, but only 489 were built during the entire war. These handful of super-heavy tanks, while terrifying in individual combat, couldn't affect the strategic balance. Germany needed thousands of reliable medium tanks. Instead, they produced hundreds of complex heavy tanks that broke down constantly and consumed fuel Germany didn't have. The fuel situation became critical after August 1943. Romania's Ploesti oil fields, Germany's primary source of petroleum, were heavily bombed by American B-24s on August 1st. The raid destroyed 40% of refining capacity and forced Germany to impose strict fuel rationing. Panzer divisions received priority, but even they operated under consumption limits that hampered training and limited operational flexibility. By late 1943, German tank crews received an average of 30 hours of driving training before entering combat. Soviet crews received 50 hours, American crews received 200 hours. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated Eastern Front skies in 1941 and 1942, was dying. The need to defend Germany against British and American strategic bombing forced the withdrawal of fighter units from Russia to the west. Those that remained faced ever-strengthening Soviet air forces equipped with improved aircraft like the Lavochkin La-5 and Yakovlev Yakhnin fighters, plus devastating numbers of Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft. By autumn 1943, Soviet aviation achieved general air superiority over the Eastern Front. German ground forces could no longer count on air support and had to fear Soviet air attacks. The psychological impact on German troops was profound and corrosive. Lancer Benno Ziza, serving with the 73rd Infantry Division, wrote in his diary in September 1943 about the changed mood since Kursk. Nobody talks about winning anymore. The question is whether we can hold them at the Dnieper, whether we can hold them anywhere. The Russians have more of everything. More men, more tanks, more planes, more guns. They take casualties that would destroy any German division and keep attacking. Yesterday we stopped an assault that killed 300 Russians. This morning they attacked with fresh troops. Where do they all come from? Soviet soldiers, by contrast, fought with increasing confidence. They had stopped Germany's best offensive effort, destroyed elite German divisions, and were now advancing continuously. Junior Lieutenant Alexander Fadin, commanding a T-34 in the 3rd Guards Tank Army, wrote to his wife in August 1943, describing the changed atmosphere. The fascists are running, not retreating in order, running in panic. We liberated a village yesterday and the Germans had left food on the tables, half-eaten meals abandoned when our tanks approached. 2 years ago, they thought they could conquer us. Now they're terrified. We will drive them all the way to Berlin. The German defensive strategy evolved into mobile defense, trading space for time and using counterattacks to slow Soviet advances. But mobile defense required mobility, and German forces increasingly lacked it. Fuel shortages limited movement. The loss of trucks to attrition forced infantry divisions to rely on horses, which moved slower and consumed fodder that also had to be transported. Soviet mechanized forces, fully motorized and lavishly supplied with American trucks through Lend-Lease, could outmaneuver German forces that were partially horse-drawn. The Dnieper River, the last major natural obstacle before the pre-1939 Soviet border, became Germany's next defensive line. Hitler declared it the Eastern Wall, comparable to the Atlantic Wall in the West, an impregnable barrier that would stop the Soviet advance. Engineers began constructing fortifications along the river's western bank in August 1943. The Dnieper, up to 2 miles wide in places, should have been a formidable obstacle. Wehrmacht commanders hoped to hold it through the winter, gaining time to rebuild their forces for 1944. Soviet commanders had no intention of allowing a pause. While German forces were still establishing their defensive positions, Soviet units were already forcing river crossings. On September 21st, advanced elements of the Central Front reached the Dnieper north of Kiev and immediately began crossing in boats, rafts, and improvised ferries. By September 24th, they had established a bridgehead 10 miles wide and 6 miles deep. German counterattacks failed to eliminate it. Similar crossings occurred all along the Dnieper through late September and October. Soviet soldiers showed incredible initiative and courage, crossing the river under fire with minimal equipment. Many used waterproof capes as flotation devices. Others lashed together planks and oil drums to make rafts. When boats were unavailable, they swam, pushing weapons and ammunition ahead on improvised floats. Thousands drowned or were shot in the water, but enough got across to establish bridgeheads that engineers could reinforce. The most significant bridgehead formed near Bukrin, south of Kiev. By early October, the Voronezh front had pushed 2 tank armies and supporting infantry across the Dnieper, creating a salient 40 miles wide and 20 miles deep. From this position, Soviet forces could threaten Kiev from the south, while other forces prepared to attack from the north. German forces attempted to contain the bridgehead, but their counterattacks achieved only local successes at heavy cost. On November 3, 1943, the First Ukrainian Front, as Voronezh Front, had been renamed in the reorganization that created fronts named for the republics they were liberating, launched the attack to liberate Kiev. General Nikolai Vatutin committed 6 combined arms armies and 2 tank armies, totaling over 670,000 men and 2,400 tanks. The German 4th Panzer Army, reduced to 200 operational tanks and fewer than 200,000 men, couldn't hold. Kiev fell on November 6 after 3 days of savage street fighting. The Soviet Union's 3rd largest city, capital of Ukraine, was free after more than 2 years of German occupation. The liberation revealed the full horror of Nazi occupation policy. Mass graves containing over 100,000 civilians, mostly Jews murdered at Babi Yar and other killing sites, were discovered. The city itself was devastated, 40% of buildings destroyed. But Kiev's liberation had immense symbolic and strategic significance. Soviet forces now held a major city west of the Dnieper, had torn a 150-mile gap in Germany's eastern wall, and possessed forward bases for operations into western Ukraine and Poland. German response was immediate and fierce. Manstein, recognizing that Soviet forces around Kiev were overextended and vulnerable, concentrated every available panzer division for a counter-offensive. On November 15th, the 1st, 7th and 1st SS Panzer Divisions struck the overextended Soviet flank near Zhytomyr. The Germans achieved complete surprise, cutting off and encircling several Soviet divisions. In 2 weeks of mobile warfare, Manstein's forces recaptured Zhytomyr and pushed Soviet forces back 50 miles, inflicting 80,000 casualties and destroying or capturing 600 tanks, but the victory was ephemeral. Manstein lacked forces to exploit his success. Soviet reserves, always available in seemingly unlimited numbers, stabilized the front. By mid-December, Soviet counterattacks had recaptured most lost ground. Zhytomyr fell again on December 31st. The pattern would repeat throughout 1944. German forces would achieve local tactical victories through superior training and leadership, then lose the strategic battle to Soviet numbers and relentless pressure. Winter 1943-1944 brought no respite. Previous winters had seen both sides pause for reorganization. This winter, Soviet offensives continued with barely a break. In the north, the siege of Leningrad was finally broken in January 1944 after 872 days. Army Group North was pushed back toward the Baltic states. In the center, Soviet forces liberated Vitebsk and pushed toward the pre-war Soviet border. In the south, 5 Ukrainian fronts pressed toward Romania and Poland. The battles of winter, 1943-44, featured enormous encirclements, but now it was German forces being surrounded. In January 1944, 2 German corps totaling 56,000 men were encircled near Korsun-Cherkasy. Hitler forbade breakout attempts, ordering them to hold and await relief. A rescue attempt by several panzer divisions managed to open a corridor through which survivors escaped in February, but the pocket lost over 20,000 men killed or captured and virtually all heavy equipment. Another Stalingrad had been narrowly avoided, but the cost of the rescue exhausted German reserves that couldn't be replaced. The scale of operations on the Eastern Front dwarfed the Western Front. While Allied forces in Italy struggled to advance past the Gustav Line and Monte Cassino, the Eastern Front saw battles involving millions of soldiers across hundreds of miles. A single Soviet front typically fielded more troops than all Allied forces in Italy combined. The Eastern Front consumed 80% of German military strength, a percentage that remained constant despite the invasion of France in June 1944. Soviet tactics had evolved dramatically since 1941. Deep operations theory, developed by Soviet theorists in the 1930s but imperfectly applied in the war's early years, now worked as intended. Soviet offensives featured careful reconnaissance to identify weak points, massive artillery preparation using thousands of guns, breakthrough by combined arms armies, then exploitation by tank armies that drove deep into German rear areas, creating encirclements and collapsing entire sectors. The coordination between arms, primitive in 1941, now functioned smoothly. Infantry, armour, artillery and air power worked together in a devastating symphony of firepower and manoeuvre. German commanders recognized the quality of Soviet operations but couldn't counter them. General Friedrich von Mellenthin, serving as chief of staff for various panzer armies, wrote after the war about the transformation. The Russian of 1944 was a totally different soldier from the Russian of 1941. He had learned from his defeats, studied our methods, and developed his own doctrine that combined mass with sophistication. Their operations were planned with German thoroughness and executed with Russian determination. They could absorb casualties that would have broken any other army and keep attacking. We could defeat them tactically, but couldn't stop them strategically. The spring Rasputitsa, the season of mud when melting snow turned Russian roads into impassable quagmires, brought a brief operational pause in March and April 1944. Both sides used the time to reorganize and reinforce. Soviet forces massed for summer operations. German forces attempted to rebuild shattered divisions and fortify defensive positions. The pause couldn't conceal the fundamental imbalance. Soviet industry was producing 2,000 tanks monthly. German production had fallen to 600. Soviet aviation produced 3,000 aircraft monthly. German production struggled to reach 1,000. The material balance tilted more heavily toward the Soviets with each passing month. Hitler's directives for 1944 defence emphasised holding key cities designated as fortified places. These fortress cities were to be held at all costs, anchoring the defensive line and tying down Soviet forces in prolonged sieges. The concept was strategically bankrupt. Soviet forces simply bypassed fortress cities, encircling them and continuing their advance. German garrisons trapped in these fortresses consumed supplies that couldn't be replaced and accomplished nothing except dying slowly. The most massive Soviet offensive of the war began on June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Bagration, named after a Tsarist general who had fought Napoleon, targeted Army Group Center in Belarusia. 4 Soviet fronts totaling 2.5 million men, 5,200 tanks, and 50,300 aircraft attacked German positions along a 450-mile front. The offensive had been prepared with unprecedented secrecy. German intelligence completely missed the build-up, expecting the main Soviet effort would come in Ukraine rather than Belarusia. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Ernst Busch, held a salient jutting eastward towards Smolensk. Hitler had reinforced the shoulders of the salient but left the center weak, confident that the forested and swampy terrain would channel any Soviet attack into narrow corridors where it could be contained. The assessment was catastrophically wrong. Soviet forces attacked everywhere simultaneously, overwhelming German defences through sheer weight of men and metal. The results were devastating beyond anything since Stalingrad. Within a week, Soviet forces had torn through German lines and were driving westward at speeds exceeding 20 miles per day. German strongpoints and fortress cities were encircled and bypassed. By July 3rd, Minsk, capital of Belarusia, was liberated, trapping over 100,000 German soldiers east of the city. By August, when Operation Bagration finally concluded, Army Group Center had been destroyed. German losses exceeded 400,000 men killed or captured, 2,000 tanks destroyed, and 57,000 vehicles lost. 28 divisions were eliminated from German order of battle. The loss exceeded Stalingrad in both men and equipment. Soviet forces advanced 300 miles in 2 months, liberating Belarusia and eastern Poland and reaching the outskirts of Warsaw. The destruction of Army Group Center opened a 250-mile gap in German lines that could never be fully closed. German reserves rushed from other sectors couldn't fill the hole. The road to Germany lay open. In the south, simultaneous offensives in Ukraine pushed German and Romanian forces out of Soviet territory entirely. By August 1944, Red Army units were fighting on foreign soil for the first time, entering Romania in pursuit of retreating Axis forces. Romania's defection from the Axis on August 23, 1944, removed Germany's primary oil source and opened the Balkans to Soviet occupation. King Michael's coup arrested dictator Ion Antonescu and ordered Romanian forces to change sides. 25 Romanian divisions previously fighting for Germany now fought against them. The strategic consequences were catastrophic for Germany. Loss of Ploesti oil reduced German fuel availability by 80%. Loss of Romanian territory meant loss of the last buffer between Soviet forces and Hungary, Germany's last significant ally. The multiple disasters of summer 1944 destroyed any remaining hope of German victory or even a negotiated settlement. In the west, Allied forces had landed in Normandy on June 6 and broken out in July, liberating France and advancing toward Germany from the west. In the east, Soviet forces had destroyed Army Group Center and were driving toward Germany from the east. In Italy, Allied forces had captured Rome and were pushing northward. Germany was being crushed from all directions simultaneously. The July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler, carried out by army officers convinced that Germany must make peace or face total destruction, failed when the bomb placed by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg didn't kill the Führer. The subsequent purge eliminated many of the Wehrmacht's most capable officers. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was forced to commit suicide. General Ludwig Beck, former Chief of Staff, was executed. Dozens of senior officers were hanged. The purge decapitated what remained of the German military leadership at the moment it was most needed. By autumn 1944, Soviet forces were approaching Germany's pre-war borders. The Baltic states were liberated in September and October, though Army Group North remained cut off in the Courland Peninsula, where it would fight until Germany's surrender. In the south, Soviet and Romanian forces drove through Bulgaria and into Yugoslavia, linking up with Tito's partisans. Hungary, Germany's last ally, was invaded in October. Budapest was surrounded by December and would endure a horrific siege lasting until February 1945. The final Soviet offensive began on January 12, 1945, along the entire front from the Baltic to the Carpathians. The Vistula Uda operation committed 7 fronts totaling 2.2 million men and 6,500 tanks. German defences, weakened by the Ardennes offensive in the west, that had squandered Germany's last reserves in a futile attempt to split the Anglo-American armies, collapsed immediately. Soviet forces advanced 300 miles in 3 weeks, liberating Poland and reaching German territory. By February 1st, Soviet forces stood on the Oder River, only 40 miles from Berlin. The advance would have continued directly to Berlin, but logistical constraints forced a pause. Soviet supply lines now stretched hundreds of miles from their depots, and even Soviet logistical capabilities, enhanced by thousands of American trucks, couldn't sustain operations at such distances without consolidation. The pause gave German forces time to scrape together a final defense of Berlin, but the outcome was inevitable. Soviet forces would resume their advance in April and Berlin would fall in May. The Battle of Kursk had set in motion the avalanche that buried Germany. From July 1943 to May 1945, Soviet forces advanced continuously westward, with only brief operational pauses. The Blitzkrieg had been reversed. Now it was Soviet mechanized forces conducting deep penetrations, creating encirclements, and destroying entire German armies. The tactical and operational lessons learned at such terrible cost in 1941 and 1942 now paid dividends. German tactical skill and fighting quality remained high until the very end, but tactics couldn't overcome strategic bankruptcy and industrial inadequacy. The human cost of the Eastern Front transcended comprehension. Soviet military casualties from June 1941 to May 1945 totaled approximately 11 million dead and 18 million wounded. Civilian casualties approached 17 million. Total Soviet deaths exceeded 27 million, roughly 14% of the pre-war population. No nation in history has suffered comparable losses and survived. German military casualties on the Eastern Front totaled approximately 4 million dead and 5 million wounded. Another million German civilians died in the war's final months as the front moved into Germany itself. These numbers, vast beyond imagination, represented individuals, each with families, dreams, and futures stolen by war. A Soviet mother who lost 3 sons at Kursk. A German father whose entire regiment was encircled and captured at Stalingrad. A Ukrainian family murdered by SS Einsatzgruppen. A Polish village destroyed in reprisal for partisan activity. The Eastern Front was industrial warfare at its most terrible, nations mobilizing every resource for mutual destruction, feeding millions of men into battles that consumed human life like fuel. The mechanization of warfare reached its apex on the Eastern Front. Tank production alone exceeded 100,000 vehicles for both sides combined. Each required steel, rubber, electrical components, optical instruments, and hundreds of specialized parts. The factories producing these components employed millions of workers. The resource extraction feeding these factories reshaped entire economies. The Soviet Union relocated entire industries eastward beyond German reach, rebuilding them in Siberia and Central Asia. Germany extracted resources from occupied Europe, stripping conquered nations to feed its war machine. The Battle of Kursk stands as the hinge point, where industrial capacity decisively defeated military skill. Germany's tactical victories couldn't overcome Soviet strategic depth and industrial power. The best German tank commanders, the most experienced German infantry, the most skilled German pilots fought with courage and professionalism, but couldn't change the fundamental equation. Soviet factories produced more tanks than Germany could destroy, more aircraft than the Luftwaffe could shoot down, more artillery than German counter-battery fire could eliminate. Modern Russia commemorates the Battle of Kursk as a defining moment of the Great Patriotic War. July 12th, the date of the Prokhorovka tank battle, is celebrated as Tank Troops Day. Veterans receive honours, military parades display modern armour, and schoolchildren learn about the battle that broke the Wehrmacht's back. The narrative emphasises Soviet heroism, tactical skill, and the triumph of socialist industry over fascist aggression. This interpretation, while serving nationalist purposes, contains fundamental truth. Soviet citizens did fight with extraordinary courage, Soviet commanders did demonstrate increasing tactical and operational skill, and Soviet industry did produce the weapons that won the war. Western historians have sometimes minimized the Eastern Front's importance, focusing on more familiar Western campaigns. This perspective cannot survive serious examination. The Eastern Front decided the Second World War. More Germans died fighting the Soviet Union than in all other theatres combined. More Soviet citizens died than all other Allied nations combined. The battles that determined the war's outcome, Stalingrad, Kursk, Bagration, were fought in the East. The Western Allies' contribution was vital, providing material support through Lend-Lease and forcing Germany to fight on multiple fronts. But the main event was always the titanic struggle between Germany and the Soviet Union. The geopolitical consequences reshaped the world. Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe created the Iron Curtain and the Cold War that defined the second half of the 20th century. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as a superpower, its military prowess demonstrated through 4 years of increasingly successful operations against history's most professional army. The Red Army that entered Berlin in 1945 bore little resemblance to the disorganized force that collapsed in 1941. It had become a modern, mechanized, highly professional military that would dominate Eastern Europe for 45 years. For Germany, total defeat brought occupation, division, and a complete reorientation of national identity. The Reich that Hitler claimed would last 1,000 years survived 12. The German people, traumatized by defeat and the revelation of the Holocaust's full horror, embarked on a long process of reconciliation and rebuilding. The Battle of Kursk, while less famous in Western memory than Stalingrad or the Normandy invasion, represented the point where Germany's defeat became inevitable and absolute. The veterans of Kursk, Soviet and German, carried their memories into old age. Their numbers dwindled with each passing decade until, by the 21st century, only a handful remained. Their testimony, preserved in interviews and memoirs, provides irreplaceable insight into history's greatest tank battle. They spoke of fear and courage, of comradeship and loss, of the incredible violence of mechanized combat, and of how ordinary men endured extraordinary circumstances. The battlefield itself remains, now peaceful farmland and memorial parks. Visitors can walk the ground where thousands of tanks clashed, where hundreds of thousands of men fought and died. The earth still yields artifacts, corroded metal fragments that, once were weapons, personal effects of soldiers long dead, reminders that this quiet land witnessed apocalyptic violence. Future generations will visit and try to imagine what it was like when the sky turned black with smoke, when the earth shook with explosions, when death came in steel and fire. The Battle of Kursk answered the question of whether Germany could still win the war in the East. The answer was no. From July 1943 forward, Germany fought a long retreat that ended in the ruins of Berlin. The thunder that rolled across the fields of Prokhorovka on July 12, 1943, announced not just the greatest tank battle in history, but the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union had stopped Germany's last offensive, destroyed its armoured reserve, and seized the initiative permanently. The road from Kursk to Berlin was long, bloody, and terrible, but the destination was never in doubt after the smoke cleared over Prokhorovka and the burning tanks cooled in the Russian summer sun.